Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Angela, and I'm with the Office of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We are so glad to be hosting our first Know Your Rights webinar this evening with special guests from the Immigrant Defense Project. Tonight, we'll be covering important information about your rights when interacting with ICE, as well as information on how our office can assist New York 14 constituents. We know there may be a lot of confusion and misinformation circulating right now, and our primary goal for tonight's event is to share the facts and help our community stay informed and prepared. Due to time limitations and the amount of material we plan to cover, we won't be able to do a Q&A session during this webinar. However, we'll be sharing contact information at the end of the call, and you're welcome to reach out with any questions you might have. So before we dive into the presentation, just a few quick notes on housekeeping. For Spanish language interpretation services, we have those available tonight on Zoom. For folks on Zoom, please be sure to click the button on the bottom right-hand side of your screen to access interpretation rooms. I'm going to tag in my colleague Michelle as well to repeat these instructions in Spanish right now.
Para interpretación al español, haga clic en el botón de interpretación en la parte inferior de la pantalla.
Thank you, Michelle. Additionally, if you need access to CART open captions, please make sure to scan the QR code on the screen here, and we'll be sure to drop that link in the chat as well. Before we begin the presentation, I also want to share a disclaimer that the presentation that you'll be watching tonight is for general informational purposes only. Its contents are not legal advice. If you are in need of legal advice, please get in touch with an attorney. All right, I'll go ahead now and pass it over to Jenya Blazer from the Immigrant Defense Project.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you for having us this evening. My name is Zhenya. I'm here with my colleague Laura from the Immigrant Defense Project. IDP fights for the rights of all immigrants, especially those harmed by the intersection of the criminal and immigration legal systems. Relevant to this training, we've spent over a decade monitoring ICE policing practices and community arrests in the New York area. And we just want to note as we get started that immigration policies and practices can change, and the information that we're providing for this training is current as of today, February 12th, 2025, and that this training is not intended to provide legal advice. Next slide. So this is a time where there's a lot of fear, and in fear, it's really important to have knowledge because knowledge is power, including knowing that not everyone faces the same risk when we talk about immigration. So before we get started talking about what rights people have when they encounter immigration, I wanted to orient us a little bit about this. So like I said, not all immigrants are at risk of deportation, and not all people have the same risk. Most people who have encounters with ICE or who are arrested by ICE have the right to have their case heard before an immigration judge before being deported. There are some exceptions to this, including people who have existing orders of deportation or removal orders, people who entered under the visa waiver program, and people subject to expanded expedited removal. We recommend that people get individualized consultations with attorneys to understand what their own risk is and whether or not they would have a right to see a judge if they're facing deportation or if they would fall under the exceptions. Similarly, there are many types of immigration statuses that protect against deportation for a temporary period. And lastly, also important to note is that people who have green card status or they're lawful permanent residents, that status cannot be taken away without reason. Usually it's related to criminal convictions. And people who have green card status have a right to go through deportation proceedings. Next slide. And so just to kind of sum this up, that if you're not sure about your immigration status, if you're not sure if you're at risk or what your risk is or what options you might have if you encounter ICE, we recommend getting an individualized consultation with an attorney to learn about your immigration status. Immigration status can be really complicated and it can change. Sometimes people are undocumented, but they became documented. Sometimes people had status, but they lost status, and there's a whole range in between. So to get an individualized consultation about what your particular immigration situation is, what options you might have to change your status or to fight deportation if you are facing deportation, and what risk you might have of having contact with ICE or being arrested by ICE. Next slide. So we're going to get to the rights-based section in a minute, but I first want to give us an overview of the agency that we're talking about and some of the tactics and trends that we see happen on the ground and that our organization has heard about. Next slide. So first, I wanted to talk about the agencies that we're going to speak about this evening. So most parts of immigration are held under the Department of Homeland Security. Many years ago, immigration used to be under the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. But for the last 20-ish years, it's been under the Department of Homeland Security. And the three main agencies having to do with immigration are Customs and Border Protection, CBP. They're often known as Border Patrol. Those are the agents who are in charge of all ports of entry to the US. So land borders, coastal, sea borders, airports, ports of entry into the US. United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, that's the agency that is in charge of immigration applications. So if someone is applying for a work permit or green card or citizenship, most of those applications go through USCIS. And then the agency that we're really going to focus on tonight is ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That's the agency that's in charge of immigration arrest, detention, and deportation. And there are two main sub-agencies that are charged with this. Enforcement and Removal Operations, ERO, and Homeland Security Investigations, HSI. And in this time where there's a lot of fear, where there are a lot of questions about what happened, what ICE raids look like, I want to say that ICE raids are political tactics, and they're often intended to create fear. We see how ICE often uses rhetoric to criminalize immigrants, to normalize their tactics and justify what they're doing. A lot of the way that immigration gets information is through these three agencies working together. So CBP, USCIS, ICE, they all share information. And in addition to this, the Department of Homeland Security has access to a lot of different data and fingerprint information from other agencies. And if we go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about one common way that people might come on ICE's radar. So ICE is unable to fulfill their mass deportation agenda alone. And ICE relies on local police to put someone on their radar. And that happens through local policing and arrest practices. So what this looks like is if somebody, I'm here in New York, if somebody's arrested by the police and they're fingerprinted, those prints are shared from the police automatically to a national database through the FBI. And what happens is that the fingerprints are in the system with your name and your place of birth. And if immigration already has that information in their system, because maybe you're someone who's had contact with immigration in the past, maybe you have a green card, and in order to get a green card, you had to give your fingerprints and your information, or you're someone who was stopped by CBP entering the US at a port of entry, so they have your fingerprints. If there's a match in the system, that might put someone on immigration's radar, and then they decide if you're someone they want to try to deport and gather information about you. And the way that they do this is that they will maybe reach out to a local jail where you're being held. They will ask jails to turn people over to ICE when they're being released from custody. One way they do this is by issuing something called a detainer or an immigration hold. They might track someone's criminal case to see what happens, to see when court dates are, or they might go to try to find people in the community to make arrests. And so one of parts of the information that they're gathering is, where does someone live? Where do they work? And I want to say that just because someone ends up on ICE's radar and ICE believes that they can deport someone, it doesn't mean that under the law, the person can be deported, or that they don't have the option to fight their case to remain in the US. Next slide. So some trends of what it looks like when ICE goes to arrest people, and these are trends that we've heard throughout New York State over the time that we've been tracking ICE practices, and in particular in recent weeks. is that ICE agents will go to homes early in the morning to make arrests. They'll stop people on the street or in public places, which could include a public area of a workplace. So that could be the front of a restaurant or something where anyone from the public can walk in. That unmarked ICE vehicles will stop cars as people are driving to work or to home. We've heard reports of arrests for people checking in with ICE, so people who are under something called an order of supervision or who are under an alternative to detention, like an ankle monitor or something like that. In some places outside of New York City, people are arrested during check-ins with probation or at appointments with parole. We've also heard of transfers directly from police or criminal custody in places outside of New York City to ICE. And when ICE agents make arrests, it's usually teams of agents. So it could be anywhere from 2 or 3 agents to a group of 8 agents. They're often very aggressive, and the encounters can happen really quickly. And we're going to talk more about this in detail, but sometimes when ICE goes to a home or they stop people on the street or in a car, it's not always clear that it's ICE agents who are actually stopping the individual. And so we're going to talk about what your rights are when you have contact with someone and you're not actually sure who it is, if it's local police or ICE. Next slide. One question that comes up a lot is whether ICE will also arrest people that haven't already been on their radar, that they weren't specifically looking for. And the answer is yes, that ICE may also arrest witnesses who are present and who are vulnerable or at risk of deportation. ICE will call these collateral arrests. It's important to know that ICE needs something called reasonable suspicion that people are violating immigration law in order to detain or stop them. And ICE might identify people in real time through using things like mobile fingerprint devices, through racial profiling, and asking questions like, do you have papers, or asking to see passports. And even if during an encounter with ICE, what they're doing doesn't feel legal or it doesn't feel fair, it's important to know that everyone has rights during their encounters with ICE. Everyone has rights regardless of their immigration status in the United States. And we're going to talk about what your rights are and how to use them and how you can invoke your rights in your best language, even if that language is not English. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Laura, who's going to walk us through some of these rights.
Hi, I'm so sorry about that. Did not realize I was muted. So we've taken a second to talk about what the tactics are that we often see ICE using. And so now we're going to turn to what our rights are and how we can use them if we find ourselves in these kinds of situations. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about the Constitution, which is something that gives rights to all of us in many cases. It's something that can sometimes feel a little bit hard to understand, but we're going to break it down, and we're going to start by talking about the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is something that you might have seen on TV and procedurals. You know, you have the right against unreasonable search and seizure. And this is something that we often see happening with police on TV, but it also applies to ICE officers. And so the way I like to break this down is thinking about how you have different rights depending on where you and your property are located. So the idea is that we have private locations and then we have public locations. And even though I think even though often we're not totally sure who these rights apply to, these rights apply to everybody, like Jinya said, regardless of your immigration status. And so let's look at private spaces first. For example, private spaces would be things like homes or parts of workplaces that are only accessible to employees. So for example, if you work at a restaurant, the kitchen or the manager's office, that's a private place and you have protection there under the Fourth Amendment. And then we have public places. So in public would be things like walking on the street, driving a car, riding in a car, or the parts of those workspaces that are open to the public. So like Jenya mentioned earlier, anybody can walk into a restaurant, the dining room, ICE officers can too. So there's a general rule here, which is in private spaces, ICE is going to need a warrant signed by a judge or your consent to enter that space or to do a search. When we're talking about public spaces, ICE only needs reasonable suspicion in order to make an arrest. And so even though we have these kind of two general rules, like many things in the law, there are exceptions and littler bits that we need to pay attention to. And I'm going to draw attention to 3 of them today. And so the first one is the idea of something being in plain view. Even though in homes and in these private places, you have protections against unreasonable search and seizure, some things that might feel like a search aren't a search. So if something is in plain view, meaning an officer is standing there, not touching anything and just looking around, that's not a search. And so it's not protected by the 4th Amendment. A search is exactly what it sounds like. It's opening doors, it's looking under something, looking behind something, looking in something. And so when something's just in plain view, sitting out there or visible through a window, that doesn't have that same protection. If we switch to public spaces, even though I mentioned that driving a car or riding in a car is in a public space, there are parts of that car, so like the trunk or the glove box, and then also when you're walking on the street, your pockets, your purse, your backpack, those things are closed. And so those are subject to protections under the 4th Amendment. So keeping that in mind, especially pockets, it's not something that you can have a search of without a warrant or consent. There is an idea that if an officer fears for their safety, they can do a pat down of you over your clothes. So they can't reach into your pocket, but they could pat you down to look for something like a gun, and that's allowed. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk first about your 4th Amendment rights inside a home. And first we have to define what a home is. A home is anywhere where somebody expects privacy because it's the place they live. So it could be kind of like the 2 things we think about, a home that's private that you own, or an apartment that you rent, but it's not just those 2 places. If you rent a bedroom in an apartment, so you don't rent the whole apartment, you rent a room, and maybe you share the bathroom and the kitchen with other folks there, your bedroom is your home, and it's protected by the 4th Amendment. If you live at a shelter or supportive housing and you have a space that's yours, that just you have access to, so like a locker, or if your bed and your things are behind a curtain, that's your home. If you live in a tent, if you're in an RV, if you are living in your vehicle and there's a sleeping space there, those kind of mobile dwellings, those are also a home. And so when we think about homes, the protections under the Constitution aren't just related to like the 4 or like 2 walls in the case of a tent of the home. It also includes this idea of something called curtilage, which is a jargony legal term, but it's something we all understand if we think about it a little bit. So the curtilage is the area that surrounds the home where home-related activities take place. So for example, the front steps of your house or the porch. If you have a house that has a garage and a driveway, that's part of that space. If you have a space or a yard that's inside a closed fence, especially if that fence is locked, or if you live in an apartment building, the hallways inside there, those are all curtilage. And so the rule for these kind of spaces is that if the public can be there, ICE can be there. But if somebody tells them that they have to leave and they don't have a warrant, they have to leave. The example I always like when I'm thinking about this is like, I'm in my house, I'm spending my day doing something. I hear a knock on the door. I go to the door and the person there is like, hi, would you like to buy this new energy product I'm selling? Or, like they're trying to sell you something. They're allowed to be there. But the second that you say, no, I'm not interested, please leave, they have to leave. They can't stay there and harass you. They have to go. And that same rule applies to ICE. They're allowed to be on your doorstep, in the hallway, whatever, but as soon as you ask them to leave and they don't have a warrant, they have to go. And so I want to talk a little bit about what this 4th Amendment protection looks like in practice. And so remember what we talked about earlier, that ICE is going to need either a judicial warrant or they're going to need your consent, which is just your permission to enter the home. However, they're rarely going to have a judicial warrant. We've heard hundreds of reports. We've very, very rarely seen ICE with that judicial warrant that would justify searching or entering a private space like a home. And so what that means is ICE needs your consent to enter your home. We're going to talk more about this in a second, but they often use ruses or intimidation to try to trick people into doing or saying things that they can interpret as consent to enter. And so when you know that these two things, one of these two things is required, and you know that without your consent and without a warrant, they cannot legally enter, you can assert your rights. And so recognizing these ruses and these intimidation tactics and understanding how warrants work is a really important part of staying safe at home. Next page. So let's talk a little bit more about warrants, because this is another thing that we see in TV and movies all the time. Like, hey, show me your warrant, or we have a warrant, open up. But warrants are not quite as simple when it's immigration, because immigration could have one of two different kinds of warrants. They could have a judicial warrant, and that's the piece of paper you see on the left in this slide. Or they could have an administrative warrant or an ICE warrant, and that's what you see on the right. And so the warrant on the left, the judicial warrant, that is the one that's signed by a judge and it allows ICE to enter your house. If ICE has that kind of warrant, they don't need your permission because they already have the permission from a judge to enter. But like I said, as we've seen, ICE rarely has a judicial warrant. And what we've seen in practice is that if they do, they don't need to ask permission to enter because they don't need it. And so they're typically not asking for permission. What we see and what we've heard in reports is that ICE will often say that they have a warrant. They'll kind of flash a piece of paper. You in the house are unclear of what it is. And so that confusion doesn't have to be confusion. You have the right to ask to see that warrant with the door closed because, as we'll talk about in a minute, the door can be a really powerful way that you can assert your rights. So you can ask to take a look at that warrant and you could say, slide it under the door. You could ask them to hold it up to the window or hold it up to the peephole. And you could even take a picture of it so that you can investigate it a little bit more clearly. So I want to draw attention to the differences between these two types of warrants. These are just samples. And so I want to highlight especially the one on the left, the judicial warrant. This is an example of one from New York. They're going to look a little bit different in different places. So don't rely on like the structure of the paper to determine if it's a judicial warrant. Instead, we're going to look at like some real clear things that differentiate the two. So we're going to start by looking at the ICE warrant, which is on the right. And if you look at the top right portion of the paper, you're going to see the words warrant for arrest of alien, which is the word warrant, and it makes it look really official. And you're like, okay, this is a warrant. But we have to look closer because those words are not enough to help us understand if this warrant lets ICE come into our house or not. So the first thing we look at is what's circled in blue on both of these pieces of paper. It is who issued the warrant. Is it a court? So on the left, you'll see the United States District Court for, and then it'll have the district. Or on the right, you'll see it's the United States Department of Homeland Security. And if you think back to a few minutes ago, Zhenya just talked about how the Department of Homeland Security is where most immigration agencies are housed. It's not a court, it's an agency. So that's the first thing you want to look for. It's only valid to let ICE enter the house if it's from a court. The second thing you want to look at is at the bottom of the pages. It's circled in red or orange on both of them. And this is who signed the piece of paper. So on the left, you'll see that it's going to have the name of a judge and the signature of a judge. That means it's a valid judicial warrant. ICE can enter your house even without your permission. On the right, you'll see that it's going to be like a DHS officer or an ICE officer. This means that the ICE officer who got this warrant, they didn't do all that work required to get a judicial warrant. Instead, it's something that's signed by a fellow ICE officer. That piece of paper is not enough for ICE to enter your house. It's not a judicial warrant, and so they would still need your consent to enter the house. The way I think about it is if ICE comes to your door and they show a piece of paper and they say they have a warrant, it's not the whole story. You have the right to investigate more and understand, is this a warrant that allows them to enter or is it not? Let's say that you understand all of this and you do it. You say, I want to see it. You look at it. You notice it's from a court. You notice it's signed by a judge and you realize this is a judicial warrant. They don't need my permission. They can enter the house. You still want to investigate a little bit. When you look at the warrant, you want to see who it's authorizing the arrest of and the address. They could be at the wrong address. They could be looking for somebody who doesn't live there. So take a look at it, take a photo of it, keep it in your records, because you have the right to know all of these things that's happening around you. Next slide, please. Okay. So knowing that ICE rarely has a judicial warrant, we know that ICE is often going to need your consent to enter the house. And so here at IDP, through litigation, we've gained access to the training materials for ICE officers in the field, and coupled with hundreds of reports that we've gotten from folks throughout the past decade or so, we have a good sense of how ICE officers are trained and what the trends are that we've seen. And so we know that the officers are often using ruses in order to get your permission or your consent to enter your house. And so that's really the purpose of ruses. Since they don't have a warrant, they need to get your consent in order to enter. They either want to deceive you into thinking that they're not ICE, or they lie so that you come to believe that they do have a right to enter, or they want to intimidate or scare you so that you don't want to assert your rights. And so I want to talk about what some of these ruses that we've seen and that we've heard about are. And so one that we often hear reports of is ICE pretending to be the local police. So if you take a look at the picture on the slide, this is from the New York Times. You'll notice that the folks here are wearing shirts and bulletproof vests. They say police. They don't say ICE. They don't say DHS. So all we know about them is that it's the police. ICE officers, we've heard reports of them saying things like, hey, we're here, we're investigating a crime in the neighborhood. Or they'll show a picture of someone who they say is a suspect and start asking questions to try to either gain entry or understand more about who the people are who are in the home. We've also heard reports of them coming to folks' houses and saying, this person who lives here missed a criminal court date. We need them to step outside. We need to talk about this. And so these ruses get people to think that they are the police rather than ICE. In addition to acting like the police, we've also heard lots of reports of other things that ICE has done to try to mislead people to think that it's not ICE at the house. So we've heard reports of ICE saying that they are looking to hire someone for construction work on a house. We've heard reports of ICE saying that they're there to discuss the Bible. Could they just come in? We've heard reports of ICE calling a barber shop and saying, hey, I want to get my hair cut by this specific barber. When does he work? What days or times? And when they show up for their haircut and the barber is there, they arrest the barber. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know the tactics. We know what our rights are. I want to talk about what it actually looks like to put it into practice. So as we're situated now, we're in our home. There's a knock at the door. We're not sure who it is. We go to look, we've got some questions. And so there are 5 takeaways here that I want to go through, and we're talking about what our rights are. The first right that we have is to not open the door. We can ask ICE to leave without ever opening the door to speak with them. So remembering that ICE can't enter the house without a warrant or permission, you can keep the door closed. I know that talking with somebody, especially somebody you don't know, through a closed door, it might feel rude. It might feel really difficult because it's hard to talk through a closed door. But you can assert that right anyway. If the person on the other side says, I can't hear you through a closed door, just open it a crack, let's talk. You can say, I'll talk louder. One thing you might feel like you want to do is open the door a crack and say, it'll be easier to talk this way. But we've heard reports that when folks open the door even a crack, it has been interpreted as permission for ICE to enter, and they've pushed their way in anyway. So even a crack can be too much. When I think about people who live in New York, we live on top of each other, tightly packed apartment buildings and houses and brownstones. And so knowing that, and knowing that we often see ICE officers show up early in the morning, often in fairly large groups, I can think of lots of times that somebody who lives in a densely populated place might say, I don't want my neighbors knowing about this. I'm going to open the door. I'm going to let these people in. We'll deal with it in the house. And even though that's something that I can totally understand, you have the right to keep the door closed and have this conversation through a closed door. And as long as the door is closed, you don't totally know who's out there. And so the next step, step 2, is that you have the right to identify who you're talking to. So like I said, it's often not totally clear who's at your door, especially if they're telling you that they are the police. And so you can start asking questions. You have the right to say, could I see a badge? Could I have your name? Could you slide your card under the door? There are ways that you can try to narrow down who this person is at your door. If they tell you that the police, you can say, are you the NYPD? If you live somewhere else, you can say, are you LAPD, Cincinnati PD, whoever the local police force is nearby you. And you can also say, what precinct are you from? What district are you from? Try to get a sense of who this person really is. We talked about warrants before. If you haven't gotten to that discussion yet, you can ask for a warrant. And again, with a closed door, slide under the door, hold it up to the peephole, take a picture. And you could send that picture to a local immigrants' rights organization. They might be able to help you make sense of that warrant if you're still feeling a little confused. Or even if you do have a good sense that it's an administrative warrant, you can send that picture because it can help them understand what the trends are in the area where you live. The third right you have is to not give any documents or information. You can just say, I don't want to give you any documents. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to answer any of these questions. And these are all rights you have and examples of things that you could say to somebody who's at your door. One thing I do want to counsel against is ever giving fake documents. You never want to give fake or false documents because that's not going to help you in any sense. So when we talk about ICE, so far we've talked about what happens when ICE is outside your door, but what happens if they get inside? ICE is trained to enter your home. You might not be able to prevent them from entering. You might not even realize it's ICE until they're already inside. But that doesn't mean there's nothing you can do. You still have rights and you can still use those rights. And so what you can do is verbally state those rights in whatever language you feel most comfortable, like Zhenya said. I know that you might find yourself going, why? Like, especially if you've already been asserting your rights and saying, I don't give you permission to come inside. I want you to leave. And they've ignored you and they've come in anyway. You might go, why start now? It's not a magic spell. They're not going to listen to me. And that's true. You using your rights, invoking your rights, asserting your rights, it might not stop them. But when you do that, you could be potentially helping yourself or other people you love if they decide to make a legal challenge to anything that happens in the future. So there is power in you using your rights, even if at the moment it might feel a little hopeless. When we're talking about ICE in your house, we also have to talk about safety. And when I talk about safety, I mean figuring out how you want to respond to their questions and their commands to you. ICE officers often carry guns, which is part of the calculation. And so, for example, if you are in your house and ICE is there and you want to document it, you want to get your phone out and take pictures or a video, reaching into your phone might be interpreted as threatening. ICE might use that as an excuse to escalate the situation with you. So we'll talk a little bit more about documenting later, but a different approach you could take would be to take note of everything happening and write down notes later, as soon as you feel safe enough to get out your phone to type it or a piece of paper to write it down. An ICE officer might say to you, I need to fingerprint you. They might grab your hands. I could totally understand why somebody might want to pull back, but physically resisting can really lead to ICE escalating the situation. So it's really not something we recommend. Instead, this is another time when you can use your rights. So you allow this fingerprinting to happen, and at the same time, you can be saying, I don't consent to being fingerprinted. I don't consent to being fingerprinted, even as you're allowing this to happen. Again, because it can give rise to potential legal challenges in the future. Verbally asserting your rights might be the safest thing to do, and so you have to make that assessment for yourself. But another reason I like the idea of verbally asserting your rights or verbally using your rights is because it can really ground you. You might know exactly what to do in a situation like this, but when you're scared, your lizard brain takes over, you go into fight or flight, and everything you know leaves your head. And so knowing this phrase, I don't want to talk to you, please leave, is something you can repeat over and over on loop to keep you present and to remind yourself that you are fighting back. Speaking is asserting your rights. The last thing I want to talk about when we talk about home is that you have the right to not allow ICE to search you or your house. And again, you can assert this verbally. I don't consent to you searching. Please leave my house. I don't want you to do that. Please leave. I'm going to pass it back to Zhenya, who's going to talk about your rights with ICE in public.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, so Laura just explained to us about what our rights are at and inside of homes. And so I want to step back and talk about what are your rights in public. And so public spaces, as we think about it, are on the street, in cars, and we're going to talk separately about cars on the next slide. Public spaces in a workplace, again, that could be anywhere that anyone from the public could walk in. So like if you work in a store, the main area of a store where anyone could walk in. At certain types of offices like parole or probation offices, at courts, areas that are all open to the public. And the key takeaway for public spaces, as Laura started this section by talking, is that in a public space, ICE does not need to have a judicial warrant or your consent to arrest you. What they need to have is reasonable suspicion that you violated immigration law, and that is the basis that they will use to try to arrest you. And so your rights in public with ICE are actually the same rights that you would have with any law enforcement, so with any police. So if you're stopped on the street by an officer, you don't know if it's ICE, you don't know if it's your local police, the first thing you have the right to do is to ask, am I free to go? Am I being detained? And if the answer is yes, then you can leave and you can, walk away. If the answer is no, or there are more questions that are being asked of you, you have the right to remain silent. And like Laura said before, invoking your right or using your right to remain silent, you can just remain silent and not answer any questions, or you can actually verbally use that right and say, I'm invoking my right to remain silent. I don't want to answer any questions. I'd like to speak to an attorney. And you can just say that on loop. And sometimes in these moments, if there are officers around you, they're asking questions at you, they're getting close to you, it might feel hard or intimidating to just remain silent. And it is okay to speak, to invoke your right to remain silent and just say something on a loop. And again, all of these rights that you have, you can invoke them, you can use them in whatever your best language is. You never want to give any false documents to ICE. And if ICE stops you, and they ask you if they can search you, if they can reach inside your pockets or go inside your bag if you're carrying something, you have the right not to give them permission. You can say, I don't consent to the search. They might ignore you and they might reach into your pocket or open your bag, but just like Laura said, you can continue to use your rights to say, I don't consent to the search, even as they do that. This is the same thing if you're in a public space and ICE tries to take your fingerprints, right? They grab your hand or they ask to take your fingerprints. You have the right to refuse to give your fingerprints. And even if your fingerprints are being taken and you don't agree with it, you can say, I don't consent to being fingerprinted. And as a reminder, these rights apply to everyone regardless of immigration status. Next slide. So I wanted to spend a minute talking about what happens if you're in a car and you have contact with ICE, because there are some things that are a little bit different. So as we talked about, cars are actually public places, but there are parts of cars that are private. So the glove compartment or the trunk, these parts of a car that close are private, or like your bag, which is in a car. If you're in a car that is pulled over by another car, there's a siren that pulls you over, or it's an unmarked car, you're not really sure who it is. The first thing that you want to do when you pull over is you have the right to identify who's stopping you. And if you're not sure, if there's no marking on the car that pulled you over, some examples of phrases that you have the right to ask are you NYPD? If you're in New York, are you the Highway Patrol? Are you a state trooper? Who are you? Why are you stopping me? You can ask similarly, am I free to go? And if the answer is no, we just want to ask you a few questions, you have the right to remain silent. And you have the right to ask why you're being stopped if you don't want to remain silent. If you are the driver of a car, ICE is able to demand to see your driver's license. If you're the passenger in a car, you have the right to refuse to give an ID if ICE asks for it. And this is something that wherever you live, you want to check in your state what the rules are if you're asked to show ID in a car, if you're a passenger, to see if the rules might be different in different states. Similar to any encounter with ICE, you never want to provide documents that you know are false or fake. If ICE asks to search you, if they ask to search the inside of the car, if they ask to search the glove box or the trunk of your car, ICE needs either your permission, your consent, or a judicial warrant to do this. And you have the right not to give them permission to do it. So you can say, I don't consent to you searching my car. I don't give you permission. You have the right to refuse to give ICE your fingerprints. And similarly, you can say, I don't consent to being fingerprinted, even if ICE tries to fingerprint you. ICE is only allowed to fingerprint people without reasonable suspicion if they violated immigration law after the point in which they've already arrested someone. One thing to say about a car is there's also like a safety assessment as well. If you're in a car that's being pulled over, you're not sure who's pulling it over. ICE officers might ask you to get out of the car or to roll down the window. And there's a real safety assessment to assess, whether you want to open the window just a crack to talk to someone, or if it seems like they're going to grab you out of the car or pull open the car door, if you decide that you want to get out of the car yourself. Next slide. If you are arrested by ICE, wherever it happens, regardless of whether you think what happened was legal, you have the right, after you've been arrested, to remain silent and to ask to speak to an attorney. And again, you can say, I'm using my right to remain silent. I don't want to answer questions. I want to speak to an attorney. Any questions that ICE officers ask you after you've been arrested, they're only going to try to use that information against you. There are certain scenarios where you actually might consider providing information to ICE after you've been arrested, especially if it's related to any childcare needs you have, if you're the caregiver for a child or children, and that's very important to provide that information. If you have any medical or health needs, you might consider providing that information to ICE as well. If ICE is claiming that you entered the United States undocumented and you've been in this country for less than 2 years, and that's actually not correct, you might consider sharing that information with immigration. When you do an individualized legal a consultation with an attorney, they can talk to you about expanded expedited removal, which is that last bullet that I just referred to, and any other situations which might merit that if you've been arrested by ICE, you might actually want to provide information to them. Next slide. Oh, and I'm going to hand it back to Laura.
Thanks, Shenya. So we've talked about documenting ICE policing earlier, hinted to it. So now we're going to talk about it for real. So you might ask yourself, why would I want to document this? And I can think of a lot of reasons, but the two main ones are you can help somebody, the person who's being arrested, in their individual case, or you could help with larger litigation, like class action litigation or some kind of thing that could help a lot of people at once. This is especially true if you are able to share your documentation with a local immigrant rights group. So when you're documenting this stuff, I know that a lot of us feel like, I witnessed this thing, I want to spread this information, I want other people to be ready. And it's really important that we take a breath and think about spreading information and not spreading fear. And so the first step is verifying information before sharing it in the public. So like we've talked about before, it can sometimes be really confusing. You see these officers, you think they're ICE. You want to make sure that you're spreading information that they actually were ICE before you spread this fear. If you're getting this information secondhand, you want to figure out, do I have information from a trustworthy source? And does it have all of the bits of information that make a verified account that we're going to talk about in just a minute here? Like I mentioned before, if you don't know the person, it can be really great to share your documentation with local immigrant rights groups. They might be able to help find the person or the attorney representing the person and get that documentation to them. If you're witnessing something in public and the person was, for example, walking down the street with a friend and they're arrested, you can pass that documentation on to that friend who was with them. And then again, social media, taking that breath and going, how do I make sure I'm spreading information and not fear? You don't want to provoke panic. And so all of the information we're going to talk about on the next slide is what I think of as the information that a really good report needs that's going to be helpful information for other people. We're going to talk about safety again. So there are a lot of ways that you can document interactions with ICE. You can take a photo, you can video record it, you could turn on your notes app or, like video or audio recording, and you can dictate what's happening as you're watching it in real time, or you can keep everything in your mind and write it down afterwards. You have the right to film ICE, which can again be like filming, moving image, or just like a static photo, as long as you don't interfere in their conduct and as long as you're not doing it in secret. Different states are going to have different rules about like what constitutes secret recording. So talk with the local organization around you to understand what that is, to make sure that you're doing it in a way that's not going to implicate more problems for you. And if you're worried that ICE might interpret your documentation as interfering, especially, when I think about on the street, you can step back and you can watch this interaction happen across the street because your actions are much less likely to be interpreted as interfering with their conduct. So again, I want to talk about reaching into your pocket. You see this thing happening, you want to help this person, you reach into your pocket or you run to grab a phone. This could be interpreted by an ICE officer as a threat. And so this is another time when you might decide to stand, to watch everything that happened, to take note of everything around you and the date and the time and the location and what they're wearing, and write it down after the fact. At the end of this interaction or during the interaction, an officer might ask you for your phone, might use this as an excuse to escalate it. This is another point where you can use your rights and say something like, I don't consent to giving you my phone, even if you are giving your phone to them, especially if they're trying to take it physically from you, because you don't want to physically resist them. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are 4 really good pieces of information to keep track of if you're going to document this, and if you want to then give this information to other people in a way that's useful to them. So the first is when and where the encounter happened with ICE. So really, in my view, not great example of documentation of ICE policing would be ICE in Queens. That doesn't tell us anything. Queens is huge. How do we know it's ICE? Where are they? When were they? Like, so many questions there. And so if instead of saying Queens, we can locate the street, an address, some kind of landmark, something that helps us really understand where they were and the time. It's not enough to just say they're there. When? I mean, this information could get passed around over and over. So let's give a date. Let's try to get a time. Was it morning? Was it late at night? Something like this that'll help us really paint a picture of what the interaction looked like. The next bit of information is how the ICE officers presented themselves. What were they dressed as? If they were in a car, what did the car look like? Were they pretending to be the local police? Did they refuse to identify themselves? How many officers were there? All these kinds of things that help us understand what the interaction looked like. The third thing is what the ICE officers said. Did they lie to enter the home? Were they intimidating? Did they use verbal or physical force? And then the fourth bit of information is more about the person who was being arrested. Did they give consent? Did they assert their rights, use their rights by using one of these phrases we've talked about through the presentation or something else? And if they did, what were the ICE officer's reaction if the person did say, please leave, or am I free to go, or one of these things? And so when you have those 4 pieces of information, you can give a report of an ICE encounter that's actually going to be helpful to individuals in your community, to businesses, schools, immigrant rights organizations, and that'll help us all keep each other safe. So before I turn it back to the team here who set this up, I just want to go back over quickly what we were talking about today. So we're in a time, like Jenya said, where there's a lot of fear. Our goal today is really to try to spread knowledge and not panic. I hope that everybody has a little bit more of a sense of what your rights are during an encounter with ICE. And we really would just want to get across that we all have rights. It doesn't matter what our immigration status is. We all have rights when we're in an interaction like this with ICE officers. I'll pass it back to you all.
Thank you so much, Jenya and Laura from the Immigrant Defense Project for that presentation. Now shifting gears to talk about what your congressional office can do to help you. My name is Michelle and I'm with the Office of Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. So as a congressional office, we can submit casework inquiries to federal agencies on behalf of our constituents in order to request information about a pending case. While we can't guarantee a favorable outcome, we can always reach out to make that request on your behalf. Some examples of cases that we can reach out to federal agencies about, especially immigration agencies, are pending work permit applications, naturalization applications, or even, as we've been discussing with ICE, we can reach out to immigration enforcement agencies in order to do a wellness check on a loved one, or to help you locate a loved one who you know to be or suspect to be in immigration detention. So consider submitting a casework request if your case is delayed, or if you would like to request that your case be expedited or just obtain more information. My colleagues will share the link that we have here on the screen in the chat, and we also have a QR code through which, if you're our constituent in New York 14, you can request casework assistance directly from our office. In order for us to submit an inquiry with a federal agency, we will need your signed consent in most cases, and this is especially true with the Department of Homeland Security. And so if we're reaching out to immigration agencies like ICE, like CBP, we will need your written consent. And right here, we have a QR code and a link to the Department of Homeland Security's privacy release waiver, which would authorize them to share information with a third party, or in our case, with your congressional office. And if you think that you may be subject to immigration enforcement in future, or you may just need a congressional inquiry with the Department of Homeland Security, then you may wish to consider filling out a Department of Homeland Security privacy release waiver in advance and keeping it in a safe place. And my colleagues will go ahead and drop those in the chat. You can access them on the screen as well. Of course, our inquiries are for constituents of New York 14 and in New York State. New congressional district lines took effect on January 3rd due to redistricting. So make sure you know who your representative is and how you can reach them. We have a QR code right here on the screen through which you can access the official House website to find your representative. My colleague will also drop that link in the chat. And of course, congressional offices cannot offer legal advice to constituents. So if you need to speak to a lawyer, if you have any questions about the information that we reviewed today and how it might affect your specific case, you can consult the Department of Justice's list of pro bono legal service providers for legal assistance. And so you can access that through the QR code on the screen, and my colleague will also drop a link, the link that you see right here on the screen. That is all for today. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you so much to Zhenya and Laura and everyone at the Immigrant Defense Project for participating in our event. And if you have any questions, we want to hear from you, so you can reach out to our office through the contact information listed right here on the screen. And thank you so much to our interpreters as well. Have a great evening.